The despicable truth behind Wyatt Earp exposes the greatest fabricated legend in American history. Far from a righteous lawman, Earp was a corrupt casino operator who utilized his badge to protect illicit brothels. After orchestrating a cowardly ambush where he executed a rival from behind with a shotgun, the government issued a massive bounty for his arrest. Fleeing Arizona as a wanted murderer, Earp died completely destitute in Los Angeles. He survived his final days by selling fake sanitized stories to Hollywood directors, successfully manufacturing a fake legacy to cover up his crimes. This is the unvarnished historical record. The cinematic frame often presents a towering figure emerging from the dust of a frontier town, a gleaming silver star pinned to his chest, his eyes fixed on a righteous horizon. He is portrayed as the incorruptible lawman, the steadfast defender of decent folk against the chaotic violence of the American West. This is the Wyatt Earp the world has been trained to revere. For nearly a century, the film industry has relentlessly projected this pristine image, cementing his status as the ultimate embodiment of frontier justice. But historical truth rarely survives the glare of a Hollywood spotlight. Behind the manufactured legend of the fearless marshal lies a drastically different narrative, one constructed entirely on a foundation of calculated deception. Far from a moral crusader, the real Wyatt Earp operated strictly as a highly adaptable opportunist, a professional gambler, a documented criminal, and a ruthless enforcer who utilized the law solely when it served his own financial interests. Rather than a steady march of heroism, his existence functioned entirely as a desperate, lifelong hustle. Dismantling this towering mythology requires stripping away the Hollywood veneer to examine the cold, forensic ledger of his early adult life, beginning not with a badge of honor, but with a federal warrant for grand theft. In the spring of 1871, the vast, unregulated expanse of the Indian Territory provided a haven for men looking to operate outside the boundaries of polite society and federal law. It was an unforgiving landscape where survival often dictated a total suspension of morality. It was here, far from the romanticized image of a peacekeeper, that a 23-year-old Wyatt Earp initiated his true career. Bypassing any pursuit of legitimate employment or homesteading, he immediately engaged in the most detested and severely punished economic crime of the era: horse theft. In the brutal economy of the 19th century frontier, a horse was not a pet. It was the fundamental engine of survival, transportation, and agricultural production. Stealing a man's horse in 1871 was tantamount to destroying his livelihood and abandoning him to the elements. Consequently, horse rustling was a capital offense, routinely resulting in swift execution by vigilante mobs without the luxury of a trial. Earp, operating alongside two accomplices named Edward Kennedy and John Davis, systematically stole horses belonging to a man named William Keyes in the Indian Territory. This was not a misunderstanding or a dispute over ownership. It was a coordinated, premeditated robbery. The federal government, which held jurisdiction over the territory, did not view the young Wyatt Earp as a misguided youth. They viewed him as a dangerous felon. A federal indictment was formally issued, and Deputy United States Marshal J.G. Owens was dispatched to track the thieves down. Owens was a legitimate, hardened lawman, and he successfully apprehended Earp, transporting him to a federal holding facility in Van Buren, Arkansas. Earp was thrust into a squalid jail cell, facing a trial that could easily have resulted in a lengthy, brutal sentence in a federal penitentiary, effectively ending his life before his legend even began. However, Earp possessed a distinct talent for evasion. During his arraignment, a federal judge set his bail at $500, a massive, almost insurmountable sum of money for a common laborer in the 1870s. Through the intervention of an unknown guarantor, the bail was posted. The moment the iron door of the cell opened, instead of preparing a legal defense to clear his supposedly honorable name, Wyatt Earp executed a frantic, cowardly retreat. He jumped bail. He abandoned his legal obligations, essentially admitting guilt by flight, and disappeared across state lines. He transformed himself into a wanted federal fugitive, actively running from the very justice system he would later pretend to represent. He resurfaced several months later in Peoria, Illinois. Peoria in 1872 was a bustling, chaotic river town, heavily populated by transient laborers, riverboat crews, and a thriving, highly profitable underworld. Earp did not use this geographical relocation to start anew or seek honest labor. He recognized early on that the quickest route to capital accumulation involved exploiting human vice. Municipal police records from 1872 provide a cold, undeniable forensic ledger of his activities during this period. The Peoria police dockets completely obliterate the myth of the noble frontiersman. Wyatt Earp, frequently operating alongside his brother Morgan, was repeatedly arrested and fined by the local authorities. The charges listed in the municipal ledgers are explicit and unambiguous: keeping and being found in a house of ill fame. Stripped of any undercover law enforcement pretense, he functioned explicitly as a proprietor and a brutal enforcer for a brothel. He was, by all legal and practical definitions, a pimp. He and his brother managed the daily operations of prostitutes, living comfortably off the physical exploitation and degradation of vulnerable women. Wyatt utilized his imposing physical presence to manage the violent, unpredictable clientele of the riverfront, extorting money from the women and protecting his illicit business from rival operations. The reality of his existence in Peoria was squalid, rooted entirely in extortion, violence, and sexual exploitation. To his respectable family back home in Missouri, Earp could not reveal the shameful nature of his income. He constructed an elaborate, wholesale lie, claiming he had spent the year hunting buffalo on the open plains of the West. This buffalo hunter alibi was a calculated fiction designed to mask a disgraceful reality. The man, who would eventually be immortalized as the greatest lawman in American history, spent the foundational years of his adulthood managing a stable of prostitutes and hiding from federal marshals. By the mid-1870s, Earp recognized that operating purely on the wrong side of the law was a dangerous, exhausting, and ultimately unsustainable endeavor. The constant threat of arrest, the fines draining his illicit profits, and the inherent unpredictable violence of the underworld required a more sophisticated, cynical strategy. He observed the socioeconomic dynamics of the booming cattle towns in Kansas, first Wichita, then Dodge City. These towns were explosive environments, flush with massive amounts of cash from the Texas cattle drives. The streets were lined with saloons, gambling dens, and brothels designed to separate the exhausted cowboys from their wages. These municipalities were desperate for order, but they were also entirely dependent on the revenue generated by the vice economy. It was in Wichita that Wyatt Earp discovered his most effective tool for extortion, a tin star. He sought a position in local law enforcement not out of a sudden, profound sense of civic duty or moral awakening. He sought the badge because he realized it functioned as an impenetrable, legally sanctioned shield for his own illicit activities. As a deputized city policeman, Earp possessed the ultimate tactical advantage. He possessed the legal authority to carry concealed weapons in towns with strict gun ordinances, the power to physically intimidate and arrest rival criminals, and the ability to control the highly lucrative gambling and prostitution trades without fear of state prosecution. He was not cleaning up the streets of Wichita. He was actively regulating the vice economy to ensure his favored saloon bosses and casino operators maintained a monopoly. In return for his selective enforcement of the law, Earp collected his own share of the profits. He operated as a legally sanctioned enforcer, ensuring the house always won, particularly when he was the one dealing the faro cards. The badge allowed him to transition from a hunted fugitive and a riverfront pimp into a powerful, protected racketeer. However, his tenure in Wichita ended not in a cinematic blaze of glory against a horde of hardened outlaws, but in a display of sheer humiliating incompetence and political corruption. The Hollywood myth portrays Earp as a steely-eyed gunfighter with perfect machine-like reflexes. The historical reality of April 1876 presents a pathetic contradiction. While sitting comfortably in the Custom House saloon, surrounded by the very gambling operations he was supposedly policing, a heavily intoxicated Wyatt Earp managed to drop his revolver. The weapon struck the wooden floorboards and discharged, the heavy lead bullet tearing through his own coat and narrowly missing his leg. It was a careless, amateurish mistake that instantly shattered any illusion of flawless competence. But a dropped gun was merely the catalyst for his ultimate disgrace in Wichita. The political climate of the city was rapidly shifting. Earp's blatant corruption, his deep financial ties to the saloon syndicates, and his violent public altercations with political rivals, including a physical brawl with a former marshal named Bill Smith over a local election, had become a severe liability for the city council. The citizens of Wichita were tired of funding a police force that operated like an organized crime family. The Wichita City Council did not commend Wyatt Earp for his service. They convened to explicitly address his violations of the peace and his unacceptable conduct. The municipal records document that the council voted to strip him of his badge, fine him for his role in the public brawl, and unceremoniously order him to leave the city limits. The supposed savior of the West was arrested by his own department and chased out of town by the very municipality he claimed to protect. Stripped of his authority and publicly humiliated, Earp was forced to pack his belongings and move further west, constantly seeking a new jurisdiction where the local population had not yet realized that the man wearing the silver star was fundamentally identical to the criminals he was paid to arrest. He set his sights on the newly established silver-rich territory of Arizona, preparing to execute a hostile takeover of a desert town called Tombstone. The migration of the Earp brothers to the Arizona Territory in late 1879 was not a noble crusade to bring civilization to the savage frontier. It was a calculated corporate relocation. The discovery of massive silver deposits by prospector Ed Schieffelin had transformed a barren mesa into the town of Tombstone, an explosive economic epicenter that was rapidly becoming the most lucrative municipality between San Francisco and St. Louis. Millions of dollars in raw bullion were being pulled from the earth, attracting a massive influx of transient miners, wealthy investors, and inevitably a sophisticated parasitic class eager to separate the workers from their wages. Abandoning any noble crusade to pin on a badge and sweep the streets of criminal elements, Wyatt Earp arrived in Tombstone explicitly to establish a ruthless monopoly. He explicitly documented his initial intentions in correspondences from the era, stating his goal was to establish a stagecoach line to control the highly profitable transportation of passengers and bullion. When that venture failed due to established corporate competition, he seamlessly pivoted to his proven area of expertise, the aggressive domination of the local vice economy. Tombstone in 1880 was a highly contested economic environment, completely divided between two distinct, heavily armed syndicates. On one side was the established rural cartel, colloquially known as the Cowboys. This was a sprawling, loosely organized network of ranchers, rustlers, and smugglers, prominently featuring families like the Clantons and the McClorys, alongside ruthless operatives like Curly Bill Brocious and Johnny Ringo. They controlled the vast arid county surrounding the town, operating a highly lucrative international smuggling ring that moved stolen Mexican cattle across the porous border to supply beef to the booming mining camps and the military outposts. They were the entrenched local power, enjoying significant political support from the rural demographics and the Democratic Party apparatus, specifically through their alliance with the county sheriff Johnny Bean. On the other side of this territorial divide were the Earps, representing an urban, highly aggressive corporate syndicate. Wyatt, alongside his brothers Virgil and Morgan, recognized that attempting to compete with the Cowboys in the cattle rustling business was inefficient and geographically impossible. Instead, they focused entirely on controlling the concentrated wealth within the town limits. Wyatt utilized his formidable reputation for violence and intimidation to secure a highly coveted ownership percentage in the Oriental Saloon, the most luxurious and profitable gambling establishment in Tombstone. To enforce his territorial claims and protect his faro tables from rival operators, Wyatt imported his own specialized muscle, John Henry "Doc" Holliday. Holliday was not a romantic, tragic Southern gentleman. He was a terminal tuberculosis patient, a professional gambler, and a documented killer who possessed absolutely no regard for human life, including his own. With Holliday functioning as the syndicate's primary enforcer, the Earps established a rigid, violently protected monopoly over the urban vice trade, shattering the cinematic illusion of a righteous battle between law and lawlessness. The ensuing conflict, leading to the most famous shootout in American history, manifested as a brutal, inevitable turf war between the urban gambling syndicate and the rural smuggling cartel. The tension escalated throughout 1881, driven primarily by economics and political ambition. Wyatt Earp recognized that true, unassailable power required the absolute control of the municipal tax revenue. He launched a vicious political campaign to unseat Johnny Bean as Cochise County Sheriff. The position of sheriff was not a salaried civil service job. It was a highly lucrative enterprise. The sheriff retained a significant percentage of all taxes collected, making it one of the wealthiest positions in the territory. Wyatt wanted the badge not to enforce the law, but to legally secure a fortune and utilize the sheriff's office as an armed guard for his own syndicate. When a series of high-profile stagecoach robberies threatened the economic stability of the region, both syndicates actively attempted to frame the other, utilizing the local newspapers as propaganda machines to destroy their rivals' political credibility. This toxic environment of economic competition, political corruption, and armed intimidation finally detonated on the cold afternoon of October 26, 1881. The cinematic mythology of the gunfight at the OK Corral presents a perfectly choreographed duel, with honorable lawmen bravely marching into a spacious sunlit horse corral to face down a gang of heavily armed outlaws. The forensic reality of the event is a claustrophobic, disorganized, and brutally swift public execution. The violence did not occur in the OK Corral. It took place several doors down, entirely contained within a narrow 15-foot wide dirt alleyway on Fremont Street. This vacant lot was flanked on one side by C.S. Fly's boarding house and photography studio, and on the other by a private residence. It was a geographic bottleneck, a deadly confined space with absolutely no avenues for lateral movement or escape. The catalyst for the violence was purportedly a municipal ordinance prohibiting the carrying of firearms within city limits. Following a night of heavy drinking and verbal threats by a belligerent Ike Clanton, Virgil Earp, holding the position of city marshal, made the decision to disarm the cowboys, who were gathering in the empty lot preparing to leave town. However, Virgil did not execute this police action using neutral deputies. In a fatal calculated move that stripped the operation of any legitimate law enforcement credibility, Virgil deputized his brothers, Wyatt and Morgan, and handed a short-barreled shotgun to Doc Holliday. He effectively transformed a municipal police action into an armed confrontation between two rival gangs. When the Earp Syndicate, dressed in heavy black dusters, turned the corner onto Fremont Street and marched into the narrow alleyway, they confronted 5 members of the cowboy faction: Ike and Billy Clanton, Tom and Frank McClory, and Billy Claiborne. The distance between the two heavily armed groups was terrifyingly short, estimated at no more than 6 to 10 feet. At this extreme close range, diplomacy was impossible. The historical debate over who fired the first shot has consumed historians for a century, but the forensic outcome renders the debate largely irrelevant. Within seconds, the claustrophobic alleyway erupted into a deafening, blinding storm of violence. The discharge of black powder cartridges instantly filled the narrow space with thick, choking smoke, reducing visibility to zero. The gunfight lasted no more than 30 seconds, and it possessed none of the chivalric precision of a Hollywood Western. It was a chaotic, desperate slaughter. Doc Holliday, acting with cold premeditation, stepped forward and discharged his concealed shotgun directly into the chest of Tom McClory at point-blank range. The massive impact of the buckshot nearly tore McClory in half, killing him before he hit the dirt. Extensive historical evidence strongly suggests that Tom McClory was completely unarmed at the time of the shooting, rendering his death not a casualty of a gunfight, but a summary execution. Billy Clanton, only 19 years old, was struck in the chest and abdomen almost immediately, but he continued to fire his revolver while slowly bleeding to death against the side of the wooden building. Frank McClory was shot in the stomach, staggered out of the alleyway onto Fremont Street, and was finally killed by a synchronized volley from Morgan Earp and Doc Holliday that shattered his skull. When the smoke finally cleared from the alleyway, the horrifying reality of the cartel war was exposed to the citizens of Tombstone. Tom and Frank McClory were dead. Billy Clanton lay dying in agonizing pain. Virgil and Morgan Earp had sustained severe gunshot wounds to the leg and shoulder, respectively. Ike Clanton and Billy Claiborne, both unarmed, had fled the alleyway in sheer terror the moment the shooting began. Wyatt Earp stood completely untouched, surveying the carnage he had helped engineer. The immediate public reaction was not one of relief or gratitude. The citizens of Tombstone did not view the Earps as heroes. They viewed them as a police death squad that had just murdered 3 men in broad daylight. Sheriff Johnny Behan arrived on the scene as the bodies were seen dragged from the mud, and he immediately attempted to place Wyatt Earp under arrest for murder. Earp, fully utilizing the arrogant authority he believed his syndicate possessed, blatantly refused to submit to the arrest, stating he would not be disarmed by a rival faction. The legal aftermath of the massacre completely exposed the corrupt, highly politicized nature of the frontier justice system. Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday were eventually thrown into the county jail, facing multiple charges of premeditated murder. The resulting month-long preliminary hearing, presided over by Justice of the Peace Wells Spicer, was not a pursuit of absolute truth. It was a desperate, highly orchestrated political cover-up. The prosecution presented a devastatingly strong case, supported by numerous civilian eyewitnesses who testified that Tom McClory was unarmed, that Billy Clanton had thrown his hands in the air attempting to surrender, and that the Earps had initiated the firing without provocation. Sheriff Behan took the stand and explicitly testified that the Earps had executed a calculated assassination. Facing the very real possibility of the gallows, Wyatt Earp took the stand. He refused to be cross-examined. Instead, he read from a carefully constructed pre-written statement drafted by his high-priced legal team, portraying himself as a dedicated lawman, simply protecting his life against known assassins. The defense relied entirely on the assertion that the badge immunized them from prosecution. Judge Wells Spicer, a staunch Republican political ally of the Earp Syndicate with deep ties to the urban mining interests, delivered a highly controversial ruling. He did not declare that the Earps were innocent of brutality, nor did he deny the excessive violence of the encounter. Instead, Spicer dismissed the murder charges entirely based on a technicality of authority. He ruled that Virgil Earp, functioning as the chief of police, possessed the legal right to deputize his brothers and Holliday. Therefore, their actions, regardless of how violent or poorly executed, were legally cloaked in the authority of the state, Spicer ruled that the chaotic nature of the gunfight made it impossible to prove premeditated malice beyond a reasonable doubt. Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday walked out of the courtroom as free men. The badge had functioned exactly as Wyatt had always intended. It was not an instrument of justice. It was an impenetrable state-sanctioned shield for homicide. The urban syndicate had successfully utilized the municipal legal system to legally exterminate the leadership of their rural rivals. But the dismissal of the charges did not end the conflict. It merely guaranteed that the violence would escalate beyond the confines of the courtroom and spill out into the open desert. The cowboy faction, denied legal justice by a corrupt judge, immediately recognized that the only remaining recourse was absolute unmitigated vengeance. The streets of Tombstone had been cleared of bodies, but the cartel war was about to mutate into a campaign of relentless, shadowy assassinations, fundamentally altering Wyatt Earp's trajectory and permanently stripping away the final fragile illusion that he was a man of the law. The dismissal of the murder charges by Judge Wells Spicer did not pacify the Arizona territory. It functioned as a starting gun for a campaign of absolute asymmetrical warfare. The cowboy faction, having witnessed the urban gambling syndicate successfully leverage a corrupt judiciary to literally get away with murder in broad daylight, realized that the municipal law of Tombstone was entirely fraudulent. They abandoned any pretense of utilizing the courts and resorted to the brutal foundational arithmetic of the frontier: blood for blood. The Earp syndicate, stripped of their veneer of invincibility, was forced to retreat into the Cosmopolitan Hotel, transforming the luxury establishment into a heavily armed bunker. They were no longer the undisputed masters of the town's vice trade. They were targets marked for extermination. The retaliation was swift, cowardly, and devastatingly effective. On the freezing night of December 28, 1881, Virgil Earp stepped out of the Oriental Saloon to cross Allen Street. He was not afforded the luxury of a face-to-face confrontation. From the darkened shadows of an unfinished building across the street, a devastating barrage of buckshot was unleashed. The heavy lead pellets tore through the night, obliterating the window behind Virgil and striking him with massive kinetic force. His left arm was completely shattered, the bone splintered beyond medical repair, permanently crippling the man who had ordered the hit at the OK Corral. The message was unmistakable. The badge could no longer protect them from the dark. The psychological breaking point for Wyatt Earp occurred 3 months later, on the evening of March 18, 1882. Morgan Earp, the brother who had stood beside him in Peoria brothels and Wichita saloons, was playing a casual game of billiards at Campbell Hatch's saloon. It was a relaxed environment, a rare moment of suspended paranoia. As Morgan leaned over the green felt table to line up a shot, the glass window of the back door suddenly exploded. A heavy caliber bullet fired from the dark alleyway ripped through the night, entering Morgan's lower back, severing his spine, and exiting through his abdomen before lodging into the thigh of a bystander. Morgan collapsed to the floor in absolute agony. He was carried to a nearby lounge chair, where he bled to death over the next hour, surrounded by his terrified brothers. The cowboy faction had successfully executed a decapitation strike against the Earp syndicate, utilizing the exact same ruthless, unannounced violence that the Earps had popularized. The assassination of Morgan Earp completely dismantled Wyatt's remaining psychological tethers to the concept of law enforcement. The judicial system had failed to indict the men suspected of the murder, as the cowboys easily provided ironclad alibis for one another. Realizing the municipal apparatus was useless, Wyatt Earp discarded the fragile mask of the civic peacekeeper. He did not seek to arrest the men responsible and present them to a jury. He decided to implement a systematic extrajudicial purge. He leveraged a vaguely defined federal commission as a deputy United States Marshal, not to uphold the Constitution, but to illegally deputize a private death squad. His posse was composed entirely of hardened killers, including Doc Holliday, Sherman McMaster, Turkey Creek Jack Johnson, and Texas Jack Vermillion. Crucially, this hit squad was not funded by the federal government. Their expenses, ammunition, and horses were quietly subsidized by the wealthy mining corporatists of Tombstone, who viewed the Earp posse as a convenient, deniable instrument to permanently eradicate the rural smuggling cartel that was disrupting their freight lines. This campaign of terror, deeply romanticized by Hollywood as the Vendetta Ride, began with an act of sheer premeditated butchery. On March 20th, 1882, Wyatt and his heavily armed squad escorted the crippled Virgil Earp and his family to the train station in Tucson, seeking to safely evacuate them to California. As the train prepared to depart the dark, coal smoke-filled rail yard, Earp spotted two prominent members of the cowboy faction, Frank Stilwell and Ike Clanton. The cinematic translation of this event inevitably depicts a tense, honorable quick draw beneath the gas lamps. The forensic reality documented by the Pima County coroner reveals a horrific mechanized slaughter. Bypassing any honorable challenge to a duel, Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday systematically hunted Stilwell through the dark labyrinth of the train cars like a wounded animal. When they finally cornered Stilwell on the gravel tracks, completely disregarding standard protocol for a lawful arrest, they brutally executed him on the tracks. The coroner's report provides a chilling, undeniable ledger of the violence. Frank Stilwell was not shot once in the chest. His body was completely pulverized. He sustained a massive point-blank shotgun blast to the torso that left severe powder burns on his coat, indicating the weapon was discharged merely inches from his body. Another shotgun blast shredded his leg. In addition to the buckshot, he was shot 4 times with heavy-caliber revolvers, the bullets tearing through his arms and abdomen. The physical evidence proves that Stilwell was fired upon by multiple men simultaneously, his body absorbing a catastrophic amount of lead as he frantically attempted to shield himself or run away. He was left bleeding to death on the tracks, a mangled pile of meat and bone. This was not an act of frontier justice. It was an organized gangland assassination executed in a major municipal rail yard. The brutal nature of Stilwell's murder sent shockwaves through the territorial government. The authorities in Tucson, who harbored no political loyalty to the Earp syndicate, reacted with immediate outrage. A grand jury was convened and explicit, unavoidable warrants for first-degree murder were issued for Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, and their accomplices. This legal action marked the definitive, irreversible destruction of the Wyatt Earp myth. The moment the telegraph wires transmitted those murder warrants across Arizona, Wyatt was officially stripped of his law enforcement camouflage. He was no longer a controversial marshal operating in the gray areas of the law. He was a wanted, highly dangerous fugitive fleeing a capital murder charge. He had become exactly the type of man he had spent his career pretending to hunt. Ignoring the warrants, the Earp death squad rode out of Tucson and deep into the unforgiving terrain of the Dragoon Mountains, transitioning from a targeted assassination team into a mobile firing squad. Their next victim was a marginalized, low-level associate of the Cowboys named Florentino Cruz, sometimes referred to as Indian Charlie. Cruz was not a mastermind or a hardened gunfighter. He was a terrified laborer caught in the crossfire of a cartel war. When Earp's heavily armed posse captured him near a remote wood camp, they did not read him his rights or transport him to a jail cell. They dragged him into the brush and subjected him to a terrifying, violent interrogation. Under the absolute threat of death, they extracted a coerced confession regarding his peripheral involvement in Morgan's murder. Once the confession was secured, Cruz's usefulness expired. He was not handed over to the courts. He was executed in the desert dirt, his body riddled with bullets and left to rot in the sun, a disposable casualty in Wyatt's psychotic quest for absolute retribution. The blood-soaked trajectory of the Vendetta ride reached its chaotic climax on March 24, 1882, at a remote watering hole known as Iron Springs. The Earp squad, riding exhausted horses and operating under extreme paranoia, unexpectedly blundered into a heavily fortified cowboy encampment led by the notorious Curly Bill Brocius. The ensuing firefight was not a grand tactical masterpiece. It was a sudden, panicked explosion of violence triggered by sheer accident. As the posse rode into the canyon, they were immediately met with a devastating wall of rifle fire from the entrenched cowboys. The Hollywood narrative insists that Wyatt Earp, displaying superhuman courage, stood tall and unflinching amidst a hail of bullets, methodically returning fire while his coattails fluttered in the wind. The historical reality of Iron Springs is vastly more disorganized and desperate. When the shooting commenced, the Earp posse suffered an immediate, terrifying breakdown of unit cohesion. Texas. Jack Vermillion's horse was shot out from under him, pinning him to the ground. Rather than holding the line, the majority of Earp's squad, including the legendary Doc Holliday, panicked under the intense suppression fire and executed a frantic, immediate retreat, abandoning Wyatt and Vermillion in the kill zone. Wyatt Earp survived the encounter at Iron Springs not through supernatural bravery, but through a combination of blind luck and the devastating, indiscriminate power of a short-barreled shotgun. Armed with a 10-gauge double-barreled shotgun, a weapon requiring absolutely no precision aiming at close range, Wyatt fired directly into the charging figure of Curly Bill Brocius. The massive spread of heavy buckshot struck Brocius in the chest and abdomen, nearly cutting the cartel leader in half and killing him instantly. With their leader dead, the cowboy fire momentarily faltered. Wyatt did not stand his ground to finish the fight. He utilized the brief lull in the shooting to frantically remount his terrified horse and flee the canyon, leaving the severely outgunned Vermillion to crawl to safety through the brush. The death of Curly Bill effectively decapitated the rural smuggling cartel, but it did not secure a victory for Wyatt Earp. The shootout at Iron Springs was the final desperate gasp of a syndicate that had completely run out of options, territory, and political capital. As Wyatt and his surviving hit squad regrouped in the desert, the suffocating reality of their situation became undeniable. They were entirely out of money. Their wealthy corporate backers in Tombstone, horrified by the issuance of state murder warrants and the highly publicized, brutal nature of the assassinations, completely severed their financial support. More critically, Sheriff Johnny Bean, leading a massive, heavily armed posse backed by the legal authority of the territorial government, was relentlessly hunting them down. Wyatt Earp was surrounded. Every town in Arizona held a telegraph office containing a warrant for his arrest and a rope waiting for his neck. He could no longer manipulate the courts. He could no longer hide behind a badge, and he could no longer outgun the entire state apparatus. The man who had arrived in Tombstone to conquer a city and build an empire of vice was forced to confront the ultimate consequence of his own corruption. In April 1882, recognizing that remaining in Arizona meant a guaranteed execution, Wyatt Earp and his death squad made a final, cowardly decision. They abandoned their properties, their lucrative gambling interests, and their cartel ambitions. They turned their horses north and rode frantically across the territorial border into New Mexico, eventually seeking asylum in the sprawling mountains of Colorado. The great frontier lawman did not ride off into the sunset, having cleansed the town of evil. He fled in the dead of night like a common thief, permanently exiled from the territory, leaving behind a legacy composed entirely of shattered glass, corrupt verdicts, and shotgun-mutilated corpses. The cartel war was over, and Wyatt Earp had lost. He had survived the bullets, but he was now condemned to spend the remaining 47 years of his life as a wandering, destitute exile, a man haunted by a bloody past that he would soon realize he had to drastically rewrite simply to survive the bitter poverty of his future. The exile of Wyatt Earp, following the issuance of the Arizona murder warrants, was not a dignified retirement of a weary lawman. It was the desperate, nomadic existence of a professional grifter, permanently locked out of his most lucrative territory. Fleeing into the mountains of Colorado to avoid extradition and the hangman's noose, Earp recognized that he could never again leverage the camouflage of a municipal police badge. The territorial governors were acutely aware of his paramilitary death squad, and his reputation as a reliable state-sanctioned enforcer was utterly destroyed. For the next several decades, Earp devolved into a transient scavenger, drifting relentlessly across the western periphery, from the mining camps of Idaho to the freezing mud of the Alaskan Klondike, and eventually to the deserts of Nevada. In every boomtown he occupied, the methodology remained identical. He did not build infrastructure, he did not invest in legitimate commerce, and he never attempted to clear a town of criminal elements. He simply established a faro bank, opened a saloon, and extracted whatever capital he could from the working-class miners before the local economy inevitably collapsed, forcing him to move on. He was a parasite following the migration of frontier wealth. This desperate pursuit of unearned capital culminated in one of the most disgraceful and highly publicized scandals in the history of American sports. By 1896, Wyatt Earp had relocated to San Francisco, attempting to establish a foothold in the city's illicit gambling syndicates. In December of that year, the city hosted a massive, highly anticipated heavyweight boxing championship between Bob Fitzsimmons and Tom Sharkey at the Mechanics Pavilion. The event generated astronomical sums of money in the underground betting markets, with massive wagers placed by organized crime syndicates. Hours before the fight, the pre-selected referee abruptly withdrew, citing extreme intimidation and threats of violence from the betting rings. In a sudden, highly suspicious maneuver orchestrated by local gambling bosses, Wyatt Earp was appointed as the emergency referee. When Earp climbed through the ropes and stepped onto the canvas, the 10,000 spectators in attendance did not cheer the arrival of a frontier hero. They erupted in furious, deafening boos. The San Francisco public, fully aware of his reputation as a corrupt opportunist, recognized immediately that the fight was compromised. Earp did not present himself as a neutral professional sporting official. In a display of profound arrogance and paranoia, he walked into the boxing ring heavily armed, wearing a concealed Colt .45 revolver tucked into his waistband. The local police captain was forced to halt the proceedings, step into the ring, and physically disarm the former marshal in front of the jeering crowd, stripping him of his weapon before the bell could even ring. The ensuing athletic contest was entirely one-sided. Bob Fitzsimmons, the vastly superior fighter, physically dismantled Tom Sharkey, dominating every round and inflicting severe punishment. In the 8th round, Fitzsimmons delivered a devastating, perfectly legal uppercut to Sharkey's solar plexus, dropping him to the canvas. Sharkey was clearly knocked out. The match was definitively over, and the betting syndicates heavily invested in Sharkey were facing catastrophic financial ruin. Wyatt Earp, functioning as the sole arbiter of the match, did not begin the knockout count. Instead, he intervened directly. Without consulting the ringside judges or the medical staff, Earp abruptly halted the fight. He raised Sharkey's unconscious hand and declared that Fitzsimmons had delivered an illegal blow below the belt. He disqualified the winner, awarded the heavyweight championship to the unconscious man on the floor, and immediately finalized the transfer of hundreds of thousands of dollars in illicit betting payouts. The aftermath in the locker room was undeniable. Multiple doctors examined Sharkey and found absolutely no physical evidence of a foul, concluding he had simply been knocked out by a clean, devastating strike to the chest. The press reaction the following morning was catastrophic. The major San Francisco newspapers completely obliterated Earp's reputation. They did not refer to him as a legendary lawman. They published scathing front-page editorials branding him a bad man referee, a common thief, and a corrupt tool of the gambling syndicates. The public outrage was so severe that the San Francisco Police Department launched a formal criminal investigation into Earp for fraud and match fixing, facing a massive grand jury indictment and the absolute destruction of his local gambling operations. Earp was once again forced to flee the jurisdiction. He packed his bags and quietly abandoned San Francisco, his name permanently synonymous with corruption, bribery, and rigged outcomes. The final decades of his life were characterized by severe financial instability and the total erosion of his public dignity. By the early 1910s, Wyatt Earp had settled in Los Angeles, California. Stripped of any status as a respected elder statesman of the West, He existed simply as an aging, impoverished man desperately trying to outrun a lifetime of bad debts and failed schemes. He sustained himself through a series of petty hustles. He operated illegal faro games in the back rooms of cheap cigar stores, enduring the humiliation of being repeatedly raided and fined by the Los Angeles Police Department, a pathetic echo of his early years as a Peoria pimp. He attempted to scam naive investors by promoting worthless, tapped-out gold and copper mines in the Mojave Desert, utilizing his fading notoriety to sell fraudulent stock certificates. He lived a transient existence, moving constantly between cheap rented bungalows, completely dependent on the financial charity of his few remaining associates. It was during this period of absolute destitution that Wyatt Earp recognized his final, most valuable asset was not a mining claim or a gambling table, but the highly malleable nature of his own history. The burgeoning Hollywood film industry was actively seeking dramatic narratives of the American West, hungry for stories of gunfights and honorable lawmen to feed the growing public appetite for cinematic escapism. Earp realized that he could commodify his past, but to do so, he had to completely sanitize the ledger. He began frequenting the dusty backlots of the early Hollywood studios, loitering around the sets of silent westerns. The man who had organized death squads in Arizona was now a pathetic figure, working occasionally as an unpaid consultant, offering to bring coffee to directors like John Ford, desperately trying to convince the studio executives to purchase the rights to his life story. He needed the Hollywood money simply to pay his rent, and he was entirely willing to compromise whatever remained of the historical truth to get it. The architecture of this massive historical deception was fully realized when Earp was introduced to a former journalist and aspiring biographer named Stuart Lake. Lake recognized the immense commercial potential of Wyatt Earp, but he also realized that the true forensic record of Earp's life, the horse theft, the brothels, the rigged boxing matches, and the extrajudicial assassinations, was entirely unsellable to a mainstream American audience that craved a pristine hero. Therefore, Lake and Earp entered into a quiet, cynical collaboration to systematically rewrite history. Operating far beyond the boundaries of historical nonfiction, the resulting biography served as a masterpiece of manufactured propaganda. Lake completely excised the arrest warrants, the corruption, and the cowardice. He elevated the chaotic slaughter in the alleyway of Tombstone into a grand, mythical battle between good and evil. Furthermore, to cement Earp's status as a superhuman gunfighter, Lake simply invented physical artifacts that never existed in reality. He fabricated the legend of the Buntline Special, a massive custom-made Colt revolver with a 12-inch barrel supposedly presented to Earp by the famous dime novelist Ned Buntline as a token of gratitude for his service. Exhaustive historical research and the production archives of the Colt Manufacturing Company prove definitively that this weapon never existed. Ned Buntline never visited Dodge City, and he never met Wyatt Earp. The iconic long-barreled revolver was a pure literary invention designed to give the aging grifter a mythological weapon, a cinematic prop that Hollywood eagerly adopted as historical fact. However, the most ruthless and tragic aspect of this historical whitewashing was orchestrated not by Stuart Lake or the studio executives, but by Earp's aggressive, fiercely protective common-law wife, Josephine Marcus. Josephine was obsessed with maintaining an aura of aristocratic respectability, and she recognized that Wyatt's actual past was a severe threat to their potential Hollywood income. She wielded absolute editorial control over Stuart Lake's manuscript, threatening aggressive litigation if any unsavory details were included. She forced Lake to completely erase Wyatt's time in Peoria, terrified that the public would discover she was married to a former pimp. But her most devastating act of historical censorship was the complete deliberate erasure of a woman named Mattie Blaylock. Mattie was Wyatt Earp's common-law wife during the entirety of the Kansas and Tombstone years. She had stayed by his side through the corruption, the cartel wars, and the intense paranoia of the Arizona Territory. But when the murder warrants were issued and Wyatt fled Tombstone in the dead of night to save his own life, he abandoned Mattie. He left her completely destitute, isolated in a hostile territory without any financial support or means of escape, while he ran off with Josephine. The historical record regarding Mattie Blaylock is a horrific indictment of Wyatt Earp's fundamental lack of humanity. Abandoned and desperate, Mattie was forced to return to the only survival mechanism available to a marginalized woman on the frontier: prostitution. She drifted to a squalid mining camp in Pinal City, Arizona. Consumed by the trauma of her abandonment and the brutal reality of her existence, she developed a severe addiction to laudanum, a highly potent liquid opiate. The coroner's report from July 1888 documents her horrific end. Mattie Blaylock died alone in a filthy, isolated cabin, having intentionally consumed a massive, fatal overdose of laudanum. She was buried in an unmarked grave in a desert cemetery, a discarded casualty of Wyatt Earp's ambition. Josephine Earp ensured that Mattie's name, her suffering, and her tragic suicide were entirely purged from the Stuart Lake biography. The heroic frontier marshal could not be revealed as a man who abandoned his wife to die in a prostitution camp. The myth required a clean slate, and the blood of Mattie Blaylock was simply wiped from the ledger. The ultimate legacy of Wyatt Earp is a chilling testament to the overwhelming power of manufactured media and the terrifying ease with which historical truth can be overwritten by cinematic illusion. He was not an agent of justice. He was the absolute embodiment of frontier corruption. He was a man who utilized the law as a weapon of extortion, who orchestrated the murder of his rivals, who rigged sporting events for gambling syndicates, and who abandoned the people who trusted him the most. Yet, because he managed to survive the bullets and lived long enough to collaborate with the Hollywood apparatus, he successfully executed the greatest grift of his entire criminal career. He sold a counterfeit version of his life to a public desperate for heroes, effectively stealing the respect and admiration of posterity that he never legitimately earned. The silver screen continues to project the towering, righteous lawman, masking the forensic reality of a desperate, violent scavenger who spent his entire life running from the truth, ultimately finding his only true sanctuary hiding behind a wall of beautiful, highly profitable lies.